Hello, everyone, as you're joining. It's lovely to see everybody. I just want to joyfully welcome everybody today to Celebrate Learning Week. Today is our first day of Celebrate Learning Week, which promises to be an amazing series of sessions. But before getting into any of that, I want to gratefully acknowledge that we are gathered today on many unceded territories, specifically on the UBC campus, if you're joining us from there, from Vancouver campus. Many of you will be joining from the unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I would like to acknowledge that I am a settler on this land. I'm joining you from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation's unceded territory. And I am so grateful to be able to be joining you from these lands that have been caretaken and loved and occupied and lived in for thousands of years by all of these traditional owners. I'm here with gratitude and want to acknowledge that we are here today in the spirit of relationship and gratitude for being able to live, work, and learn on these lands. Reconciliation and land acknowledgement is important because of the central mandate for UBC, which is reconciliation and acknowledgement of the land on which UBC is placed. And we want to begin this meeting and this session in such a way that reminds us all of the important mission that we have to continue on with that mission of reconciliation and consider in everything that we do the continuing acts of colonization and find ways in every act that we perform to rethink and turn over our practices that lead to the continuation and perpetuation of the effects of colonization. This is a central mission for UBC, as I said, and it's a mission that I'm incredibly proud and privileged to be a part of. So I would like to acknowledge that this is our real goal here in everything that we do, is to foreground that mission in our approach to education and in our approach to living on these lands and working and learning here. The reason that I'm so excited about Celebrate Learning Week this time is not just because we have this exciting keynoter, hi Brian, but because this is just such an incredible time for education generally, which actually comes off to some extent of the mission around decolonization, because education is being dramatically changed by this new technology, by generative AI and AI in general. We're all basically asked, and will eventually be forced, to think about how these new technologies will change the way that we educate and will change our relationship to our students and ourselves as educators, and to the subject matter that we all teach and are working with. So it's a tremendously exciting time, and it's a kind of scary time. Celebrate Learning Week has taken on this mantle with its theme this year, which is remembering the human in the loop. So for those of you not fully brought in on the whole AI thing, the human in the loop has been for a long time the human side of the learning of generative AI. So AI learns by learning from humans. So for a long time, there has been a human in the loop. There's been somebody training the data sets or somebody checking the correctness of outputs. There's always been a person who has to be involved somehow, and that's the human in the loop. And that's us. We're the humans in the loop. We're the educators in the loop. We're the learners in the loop. And we do have to check with ourselves and check in with ourselves as we move forward into this next stage, because education is are one of our most fundamental acts as people. We learn naturally, and it's important that we keep track of how we are within the act of education and not abdicate all of our approach to education to this new and very enticing technology. So in this week, we're going to have a range of amazing sessions. We're going to be exploring, what to do around generative AI, what it's looking like in the future. We'll have a leadership panel that discusses what the guidelines might be coming up in the future, what our next steps are. We'll look at, at the technological side of, what on earth do we see coming down around the next corner. And we'll have faculty panel, amazing research from the TLEF and AltSpace. It's just going to be an incredible week where we explore this theme and other themes related to humanity in education. I was recently in a lovely session hosted by Maura Quayle about the future. And in that session, the speaker talked about how when there's a river and you're sort of on a river and rafting on a river, that you don't realize when the river is still moving slowly that you're headed towards maybe a waterfall. Right now, I feel like the river has started speeding up for us. We don't know if there's a waterfall, and we don't know where the waterfall would lead if there was one. But I very much look forward to this upcoming week where we can explore the river and the waterfall and what we see around the corner. So with that, I'd like to open this session and welcome our keynote speaker, who is Brian Dewsbury. Brian, do you want to turn on your camera?
My camera's been on.
Hey, oh, great. Okay, so spotlight, Brian. I have, so I just want to explain to everyone also, just very, very quickly, other Elisa, so there are two Elisas here, which is always freaks me out. I'm actually other Elisa. Elisa, would you mind moving to the respectful environment statement slide, please? So thanks, everyone. I'm now seeing that the slide might have slightly smaller fonts, so sorry about that. But I just wanted to share that, we are excited to be here with everyone today. We want this to be a very inclusive and positive session where we are all able to share and transmit ideas to one another. We just remember that we do that in a spirit of collegiality and respect for one another, as is UBC's approach to collegial and facilitative discussion. So for questions, how it will work is we will be asking people to ask questions through the Q&A. For today, I will be asking Brian questions on your behalf, or maybe a couple of the other moderators will also jump in. So please post your questions there, and I will corral those and make sure that all of the questions are asked. We may not be able to get to every single question, so probably what we'll end up doing is grouping them by theme and then asking those at the end. So with that, I'd like to welcome Brian Dewsbury. Brian, it's absolutely lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining. Yay! I'm so happy that you're here. Dr. Dewsbury, I'm just going to read your bio. You can be bashful through that. Dr. Dewsbury is the principal investigator of the Science, Education, and Society Research Program at Florida International University, which focuses on social context of teaching and learning in a variety of educational contexts. He's an associate professor of biology and is the principal investigator of this program that blends research on the social context of teaching and learning, faculty development of inclusive practices, and programming in the cultivation of equity in education. He's also the author of several incredibly inspiring looking works on pedagogical exploration, including Reflections and Actions for Creating an Inclusive Research Environment, A Chance at Birth, an academic development activity to promote deep reflection on social inequities, and Lessons from the Chaos. And Brian is here today to talk to us about how we forge a path into this new and exciting era of education. Brian, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Nice. Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. As always, I wish it was in person, but I'm thankful that we live in a time when I can talk to you through a screen synchronously. So I'm gonna be grateful for these small things. I wish you a wonderful upcoming week. There's a lot of really interesting, challenging, but beautiful things to be discussed. And I hope that through those discussions that you collectively grow. I want to start this week off with this arresting question. It's a hard question because there's almost no way for you to know what world you actually need to be preparing for. You could only guess. You could sort of hypothesize. You can sense like the AI is coming. You can sense that climate change is happening. You can see evidence of conflict on a different political landscape, particularly in North America. These are true things that can give us a sense of what might unfold if we are not actively intervening. But for us as educators, for us as people who are privileged to have a classroom, I want us to see this as a question from which we can backward design the way we approach our craft. My friends, education for me is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing, and I'm going to tell you my story, not to have you feel sorry for me, but to have you understand that for so many of us, getting degrees and taking courses and credits and choosing majors, it wasn't really ever about the content. And please don't go to the rest of Learning Week and say, Elisa brought this dude who said we don't have to care about content. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this education was a social experience. This education was a transformative experience. That education was an interrogative experience. It was one where I had to learn what it means, sorry, to find myself, what it means to think about what is my place in this world and how should I live it. This bench you are looking at is situated in the center of the campus of Morehouse College. Morehouse College is a small liberal arts college, a historically Black college in Atlanta, Georgia. And there are several historically Black colleges in the US system. There's a big context with that. And people ask all the time if I chose to come to Morehouse because I am of African descent and Morehouse's population was 99% African American male. Well, not African American males, males of African descent, male identifying people of African descent. It was all male identifying at the time. And I said, no. They give me a full ride. This was an economic decision. This wasn't, I was coming from a different country. So in case you didn't pick up an accent, I was born and raised in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. I came to the US on a student visa, right? My parents looked at me and they understood that the things I wanted to do with my life, Trinidad wasn't a place that could support that to the level that I needed it supported. So I threw my hat in the ring. I took SATs in Port of Spain. I got a good enough score. And look, man, working class family. So whoever wrote the biggest check, that's where I'll see. That's where I'll be. And lo and behold, Morehouse wins this prize. Brian gets there on a full ride, thank God, because we couldn't pay for it. And my parents, who never went to college, never got a college degree, which is how I should put that, they came to orientation week, which, interestingly enough, later on in life, in my profession, come to find out that that's a thing that first generation parents do, right? They stay for orientation week. at the end of orientation week, they sat me down on this bench and they said, Brian, we've taken you as far as we can. Everything you do here from here on out is up to you. And at 19, I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't, what do you mean as far as you can? Like, are we not going to speak after this? It didn't seem to make logical sense. But then when my second year, my sophomore year came around, and I ran into some of my very, very, very difficult elective courses, and your boy started to struggle. And you know, you're struggling that way, undergrad struggle, right? You don't, you get a couple C's on some quizzes, and you figure, all right, well, you know, bad start, but I'll double down and I'll get to the next time, right? And so you take the same bad strategies you were using for the first quiz and you do it 10 times as hard, hoping for a different result. And a different result doesn't come. And the different results do not come. And then you wake up one day and you realize it's November. And you remember the fact that because you're on scholarship, you need to maintain a minimum GPA in order to keep that. And if you go below, that's it. And for those who are there, whose legal presence in the US was based on valid enrollment in an institution, once you lose that enrollment, you're on the next flight home, my friend. That's how it works. And so you start thinking, how am I going to have this conversation with my parents? How am I going to explain that all of these hopes, all of these dreams, all of the sacrifice, all of the belief, all of the expectations, it just couldn't work out. And even though the end of the semester hadn't come yet, I was already so flattened by just the thought of having to disappoint my parents on that level. The short version of the story is that thanks to a curve, my cumulative was at 3.01. 3.0 was the cutoff. This story could have ended very differently. And I remember in a conversation I had with my mom eventually, this is after I knew I was safe, right? And I was telling her, hey, that last semester was rough, man. It almost didn't work out. And she said, if it doesn't work out, you can always come home. You can always come home. Nobody needs to judge you. You're still our son no matter what. You see, what I need you to understand is my parents were not gonna ask me, Brian, are you using metacognitive strategies when you approach your work? Are you explaining the material to a friend? Because research shows that space retrieval is it. So when they say, Brian, we've taken you as far as we can, is that we put all our cards on this table. We have expended all of our social, financial, political, and cultural capital to get you to this bench. And for you to go beyond this bench, for you to thrive and succeed beyond it, you need other things that we don't have. These aren't the words they articulate, my friend. These aren't the words they articulated. But this is what I came to understand the hard way. So when a professor named Dr. Lawrence Bloomer, who's seen me struggle was the first person to ask me, when you think of yourself in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now, Brian, what do you see? When you look at this world, you say you love conservation. Why? What is the thing inside you that drives you to pursue that question, to pursue that goal? And at that point in my life, I didn't have the language I have now. But I understood that I had to figure out a why. The why is what had to drive the things that I chose. And also, and perhaps more importantly, the things that are going to make me prepared for the world that I was about to fully partake in included some content, but included a lot of other things. So when I ask the question, what is the goal of inclusive education? I am being subversive. Sometimes, people assume, to be honest with you, I think sometimes it's just an identity thing, right? Like they look at me and based on the things I write and talk about, that my focus is DEI. And it honestly, it's not. I talk about it a lot, and I I embed it in how I think about curriculum design and everything that I do. But I want us to be at a point when we talk about education or teaching, if it's done well, it's inclusive. That's an assumed part of what it means for it to go well. And if we can understand that, then we can ask ourselves some bigger and some better questions. This is John Dewey circa 1930, preparing students so that they can become integrated into the democratic community. I make no assumptions in any of these words. That means that when they are with us, when they're in our classrooms, when they are in our care, we don't just make good chemists, we don't just make good biologists, we don't just make good lawyers. We cultivate a sense of what does it mean to be in community? What does it mean to listen to others? What does it mean to integrate? What does it mean to maintain a sense of self, but still have the ability to love? What does it mean to not shy away from the use of the word love when we talk about community? What does it mean to talk about these things in classes that are not a general education humanities class? What does it mean to bring these things up in physics? What does it mean to bring these things up in environmental studies? In other words, to Elisa's point, what does it mean to reclaim the human in the process of education? The problem, my friends, is that a lot of the models of education, even though they wouldn't say the quiet part out loud, the reality is that we mostly prepare students for technical participation in society. So when we're looking at that world for which we are trying to educate, most times we are thinking of the technical participation. So in the US context, right, Sputnik happens, you make a bunch of PhDs, right? The economy is doing X, Y, and Z, and so you train students because they need jobs. And I want to be very clear. People need jobs. That is a fact of the economic system within which we operate. But technical participation is not the only function of higher ed. Part of the value system that we can lean into is to prepare students for civic engagement in society. And I want to explain 3 different subcomponents, I'll call it, of what civic participation can look like. Number 1, in civic participation, everybody participates. I know it sounds simple, but you don't have to look too far back. In fact, you might even be able to look last week and see that for a long time, who gets to participate depends on who's answering the question. And people had to fight tooth and nail, sometimes lose life and limb in order for their identity group to be allowed to participate through voting, through access, through being able to attend universities, through being able to be competitive for loans, through the list is long. Civic participation assumes everybody gets to participate. So when we talk about things like these particular groups don't persist through STEM classes, or there's a disproportionate failure rate of this group and that group, I want you to change your language and look at it in terms of participating. So if they're not getting through, first of all, if identity is predictive of a lack of success, then there's something in the water. There's some cue, something happening that is disproportionately affecting that group. That is preventing them from participating. That is what inability to complete a degree means. Secondly, civic participation is a commitment to a life of inquiry. What I mean by that is, well, in fact, let me say it this way. I don't necessarily mean in saying this that everyone's going to walk out of your institution as scientists. That's not my point. But there is a critical thinking element of how we look at life, how we look at data, how we look at power, right? That skills associated with that kind of process that can have formative exposure in the time that they are in our institutions. So in biology class, which what I teach, they focus on a scientific method, and you hypothesize, you ask questions, you get data, you critique. But double down on inquiry, my friends. It's not just about asking the questions. It's about when you ask questions and pose answers to it, you might be wrong. And if you are, if the evidence is there, if your opponents, and I shouldn't call them opponents, but people are able to show you, there's a different way to interpret what you're looking at, do you have the humility to say, oh, okay, let's consider that new thing? So it's not just about asking critical questions, right? Because I want them when they make purchase choices, when they marry, when in their job site, how they choose, how they look at politics, that you're not just being fed knowledge, that you have the ability to receive that knowledge, take a step back, evaluate it for its merits, ask good questions about that, but also be humble enough to accept wrong if you happen to be that way. Last but not least, civic participation assumes a social contract. It assumes that we are born into a community where we live for each other, where we love one another, where we live beyond ourselves, where we understand that the decisions we make don't just impact our own person or our own families. They impact our whole neighborhoods, communities, the futures of the children that we have if we have them. In other words, it redraws the line of what we consider in-group. So many times we are tempted to retreat into the safety of in-groups where you share a language, or you share a skin color, you share a way of being, you share a cultural norm. You can both be protective of that, but also appreciate and engage in the benefits that come from these several subgroups living and working and trying to make this democracy thrive. I understand that for many people who think about teaching and learning, or sorry, not think about teaching and learning, but who've been sort of brought into the professoriate, this is not the kind of conversation, at least certainly when I was in graduate school, this is not the kind of conversation that we had. And I have to tell you, man, like college teaching to me, it's the misalignment between how we are trained and what we actually do when we get to campus, like what we actually asked to do. It has to be, it feels borderline criminal, right? Like, like some 70, 75%, even teaching, like how much, I mean, it's getting better. I'll admit that it is getting better. But what passed for training for teaching versus the amount of teaching that I and most of us are required to do? And I have to bring this up because while I am glad that institutions like yours are having week-long celebrations of teaching and learning, if we are really educating for the world, for tomorrow's world, part of that has to be a complete revamp of the graduate student preparation for faculty model. We have to imagine a world where a student who's going into that field, who's going into that position, we have to really think of what are all the things they need to have in order to do all of the beautiful things that we know to be true, to be effective, and to be impactful for the world that we want for tomorrow. We have to be thinking along those lines as well. So what I'm going to do for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you about an intro bio class. This is my intro bio class. I've taught this class now for almost 10 years, right? And it's my favorite class, so I'm biased as hell. And it's not so much about the bio, it's really more the intro piece. You know, in the US system, intro, when you're a research faculty like I am, intro is a class people like to run from because it takes up so much time and the university a lot of times communicates that, well, you'll not become associate if you don't get 10, if you don't publish amount of papers. And so people make the risk reward calculation and say, no, even though I like the students, I'd rather keep my job, which is its own, that's a separate talk. That's next year. But intro is a special place, y'all. And maybe it's because like I go into intro and I remember I see like 100 young Bryans, right? But it's a special place. It's such a psychologically poignant time in their development. And I can see the manifestations of that exploration and of the growth and of the attempt to find yourself into this new space, both professionally and socially. And so from that standpoint, the purpose of the class is less about trying to get through a whole bunch of chapters and is more about getting you to think about your place in the world. And I am unashamed in saying that as a goal of this class. I get how the whole system works, right? We have 15 weeks and a bunch of exams and you get a grade and that grade goes with other grades and that gives you a GPA and you get labeled by that GPA. I see why that exists. But when I teach you, I'm teaching you for the long game. I'm thinking of you as a voter. I'm thinking of you as a citizen. I'm thinking of you as a consumer. I'm thinking of you as a parent. I'm thinking of you as a partner. I'm preparing you for your tomorrow's world. And along the way, we will do a lot of beautiful biology. But the content, the subject matter of that book is not the most important thing you will take away from this experience. And it is with this spirit, with this energy, is how I walk into that class every fall, every September. So first, identity must not predict success. So Brian needs to understand, how do you create a class where identity does not predict success? And the thing I need to understand, that I would like you all to understand as well, is that there is a difference between potential and readiness. Potential is something I assume. Potential is potential is something about which, based on the data that I have to believe that you have it in you to do any subject well of your choosing. At some point, if you really wanted to be a coder, you can code. If you wanted to be a doctor, you can be that. If you wanted to be a movie critic, you can be that. Whatever it is, in terms of your physiological makeup, the potential is there. I'm not saying it's going to happen in the next 15 weeks with me, but I'm saying it exists. Readiness is a whole different ballgame. Readiness is, what are the steps that you took before you got to me that will allow you to do well at this level? What is the mindset that you have when it comes to the subject matter that removes the psychological load that prevents you from being your best cognitive self? In other words, my friends, there are multiple factors that will impact a student being ready. It doesn't mean they don't have potential. It just means that they're not ready. So my job is to figure out, what is your current state of readiness? And what are the things that I need to do to walk you to the place where you can see clearly what your true potential is? That is my definition of teaching. That is literally how I define it. And so in order to figure out what that journey looks like for you, for each student, I have to understand the psychology of your behavior. I have to understand history. I have to understand sociology. I have to, in other words, I can't just have a PhD in biology, which I do, right? But knowing how proteins fold doesn't help me to do the other stuff. And when you start to understand how this stuff works, your eyes can't unopen, right? Once you open your eyes, you can't reverse what you see. You understand that for some students, coming to your office for office hours, for example, is like walking down the Green Mile. It just that notion of admitting that you're struggling feels like a sign of weakness. And so I'm not necessarily saying every student who came in poorly prepared would have that feeling. But I know from the research that it's possible. So I need to design my environment in such a way that reduces the barriers enough so that that fear of engagement is not present. Even simple things, people call it office hours, we call it student hours. There are some students who assume that office hours just meant that was when I was in my office to check email for 2 hours. They assume, even though it's on the syllabus, right? They assume it's not for them. So just a simple name change to student hours. Then we also hold the office hours in the basement of their dorm. Why? Because my office only has 2 chairs. My friends, do you not realize this system has a very clear design flaw? Every campus ever complains about students not showing up for office hours. But if they all came, where would they sit? It's not built for maximal engagement. It's built for the chosen few. So a class of 165, we were averaging 45 students a week. Simply because we changed the environment. Simply because we said to ourselves that identity does not need to predict success. So it is on me to learn what are some of the things that sometimes gets associated with your identity that might convince you into thinking that I don't need to engage in these very good academic behaviors. Secondly, civic participation means a commitment to inquiry. The Church of Active Learning will have you call this group work. And I'm not here to criticize that label. As somebody who does a lot of active learning myself and love it, I think, however, that there are opportunities in group work that goes beyond it just simply being something that's active. We call it opportunities for dialogue. And that's because that's what it is. If you choose to see it that way, that's what it is. We have groups of 4 that I manually mix to ensure that they are a diverse group of 4. And the kinds of assignments that they do, not all of them, but many of the assignments that they do require difficult dialogue. So yes, this is an intro bio class, but they are talking about the experimental design of the Tuskegee study. They are looking at disproportionate death rates from COVID in different communities. They are looking at the levels of lead in the blood of children from Flint, Michigan. And so we are asking biological questions about syphilis, about lead poisoning, about cancer in the case of Henrietta Lacks. We are also asking social questions like, why Flint? What I mean, they weren't the only city that had pipes made with concentrations of lead in it. So the nature of the assignment. So first, setting up the group in a diverse manner, right? That's the D part of DEI. But setting up an assignment that the success of doing that assignment requires skills around dialogue. That's the pedagogy. That's making it such that skill is needed. So therefore, the instructor, Brian, needs to prepare them and cultivate that skill within them. This is not just here's this racially fractious case study. Good luck with it. Don't fight. No. We start from day one. We do a process called guideposting. We talk about what it means to listen, what it means to get emotional or see someone get emotional and ask yourself, I wonder what brought him to this place. To see that emotion and not react. To respect and believe in the goodness of who's across you, no matter what the disagreement is. So the world I want to prepare them for is a world where that ability to talk across difference is one that transcends any intro bio class, is one that they take with them when they go to a bar, when they go to their place of work, when they go to their in-laws, when they go to anywhere where difference is present. You don't see it as an opportunity to dig your heels in. You see it as a chance to learn. So I'm not going to wait until the MLK breakfast for them to talk about diversity. I'm not going to wait till, a class is offered on the other side of campus and say, oh, that's the one class where you talked about. No. If you're going to put the human back in education, ask yourself, what are the value-added things that being synchronously together, that being with each other and learning from each other, what are the things that are value-added that can come from that? And that doesn't need to depend on whatever the subject matter of the classes. Last but not least, civic engagement requires an understanding of the social contract. And part of understanding the social contract is understanding when the contract was severely violated, when science was a part of the problem. And I want to be clear here, like I'm not a progressive fool, right? I think sometimes in this equity work that it's easy to go down that rabbit hole of doom and gloom and the sky is falling. And I'm the first to admit we have a lot of issues to work on, but I'm also grateful like hell for lots of the progress that has been made. Right? We got a vaccine in like 2 hours because of science. So we talk about all of that stuff, right? The way we try to put it is we want to tell the true story, right? This is not a class of just spouting facts. We want to tell and engage in the story of science and welcome you into that community. So part of the truth telling associated with that is talking about the times when, hey man, when only certain people were allowed to ask the questions and have the labs and run the experiments, there were some really bad outcomes. They used to have veterinary scientists go to state fairs to judge perfect babies. This is the 1920s. There are people alive who actually might be able to tell you about this stuff. They were still sterilizing people in California in the 1970s, I believe. And so I tell you this story. And by you, I mean the students. When I tell them these stories, I tell them not to depress them, not to darken the class, but to actually demonstrate that as humans, and more importantly, as humans who are preparing for a tomorrow world, we have the capacity to learn. As a social science researcher, I fill out an institutional review board permission to do every single study I do. And all I do is give out surveys. I don't inject anybody. I don't take DNA samples. I don't pull your hair. None of that stuff. But I still have to get permission. And I'm fine with that. But that exists because of Tuskegee, or at least in part because of. One of the concerns that people had is when you shift your mentality, when you shift your mindset away from teaching a class, especially a science class, is all about getting through 45 chapters. And when you switch it to, it's about teaching students. When you switch it from teaching subjects to teaching students, you realize that teaching students, that cultivating humanity and supporting their growth and psychological and social development requires not just being a nice person and definitely requires skills beyond just having a subject matter PhD. You realize that the class has to have some other things. The class has to have some other things that you have to make time for if you're going to do it well. In other words, you have to actively fight the tyranny of content to say, we're going to trust that if we prepare you as a critical thinker, if we prepare you as somebody who can engage in technical material, there's a lot of this I can trust that you can do on your own in my absence. And one of the things that I found amazing when back in 2014 or so when I started my faculty position, there was all this language around, students are failing this class and students are failing that class. We are talking about the world that we want to prepare students. But I want to use this opportunity to ask you, what kind of university do you want for tomorrow? Right? The world is what it is. V.S. Naipaul, very good book. But what kind of university do you want for tomorrow? Because part of everything I'm saying is a request for us to take some steps back and ask who's responsible for the outcomes from our classrooms and from our institutions. Right now, when people come at me and say students are failing X, Y, and Z, 35% rate DFWs, the way that sentence is phrased, it implies that the only entity responsible for the poor outcome are the students. So therefore, you only give yourself one option of a solution. Either you fix the students or you get better ones. But if as an institution, we can say, this course or these courses, we are experiencing unsuccessful outcomes, then you position yourself to ask the question, what are the factors that lead to unsuccessful outcomes? Certainly student effort, behavior, whatever you want to say, I'm not absolving their role in this. But also sometimes it's the teaching. In fact, a lot of times it is. If 80% of the class got question 15 right, it might be the question. But do we have a system in place that holds ourselves accountable in the same way? Do we have a system in place that holds administrators and institutions accountable for creating the kind of environment that allows instructors to thrive? Why aren't these things built into a more comprehensive forensic analysis of what the experience is? Because it's a much harder conversation than saying students fail. So what was an assumed, and I say assumed because these rates were for years, right? It was 30, 35, 40% in some cases. When you disaggregated the data, it was worse for minoritized students. In section 4, which was my section, we were able to bring that rate down to under 10%. But of course, one of the big pushbacks is, well, if you aren't going to tell them the material, you will set them up for failure in the upper division classes. And so we tracked them into the next semester and we said, well, if students from section 4 got 35% less coverage, which is about how much we took from the syllabus, shouldn't they have fallen flat on their faces? Shouldn't they have flamed out because we didn't take the time to go through the other 10 chapters that was you must cover? And when we follow them into their sophomore year, the gap actually widens. And you can check this out. This paper is open source. One of the beautiful things um, about my career, and I feel very lucky in being able to say this, is that and I'll tell you just a little bit about my story, just in the themes of for what will we prepare. And I think once my mentor at the undergrad level kind of came at me with some really arresting questions about my why. I went on to grad school because I figured need to understand the environment in order to really help conserve it, which is what my goal was. And in grad school, very well-meaning advisors would say to me, in order to be successful in grad school, you should avoid teaching at all costs. In fact, it's funny to even think about it because it wasn't even them telling you what to do to be successful. It was telling you what you should avoid. This is how low teaching was valued. And I think it's getting better, right? I'm thinking about that same department and what the culture is now versus what it was then. So there is clearly the capacity to change. And I'm buoyed by that. But initially, I took the advice and I avoided the classroom and I, got the not prize, but I got a GA-ship so I could just focus on lab work. And when I returned to do my PhD, you had to TA at least 2 semesters as a requirement, which, is like, how does that prepare you? But I mean, I didn't think about it that way, but now I can look back and see how laughable that was, right? And this happened to be the class. This group of students you're looking at right now. They happened to be the class that I taught. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was given a bunch of labs, I was told don't don't blow anything up, like, and get through it, and you'll be fine. But all of these students, most of them, maybe 95% of them, were pre-med. They were aggressively pre-med. Like, they want to tell you the pre-med before they tell you their name kind of pre-med. And I would ask them, because, in lab, you have a little bit of downtime when you're running gels or whatever. And you'd ask them, well, why pre-med? And first they would give you the very generic, well, I've always wanted to help people. It's like, well, you know, they've been having the coffee shop this morning. Have you thought about coffee? Well, no, I've been going to doctors all my life. You also went to the grocery. So I see you dig, and then eventually they say something like, pero mi abuela dice, but my grandmother said, but my aunt said, but my dad said. And so now we're starting to have the real conversation. Because that's when they start to tell you, I'm a first generation college student. I'm a first generation American. My parents have told me that when I come to this university, I have 3 options of careers I get to go after: medicine, law, and maybe engineering. How at 17 and a half, 18, do you shoulder the hopes and dreams of a whole extended family on your shoulders? And so when you get a C back on a quiz, the instructor might be thinking, oh, well, you just need to apply yourself. They are seeing their hopes and dreams falling before their very eyes. When I was in my second semester at Morehouse College, my professors had office hours. I knew it. They had office hours on the syllabus. I knew I should have gone and said something to someone. I had that voice in my head saying, you need to go. But then there's other voice that says, but if you go, they'll know you're an imposter. If you go, they will know they should have never given people like you a scholarship in the first place. This stuff doesn't make sense, my friends, but it happens. So if we're educating for tomorrow's world, even in the face of AI, even in the face of ChatGPT, in fact, because of these things, I ask you, double down on what it means to be human. Because at the end of the day, no matter what happens going forward, that is all we'll have left. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I wish that you could hear all the people clapping. There's a wealth of folks in the chat who are expressing thanks, and I've received personal communications from many areas of my DM-averse that have said, "Wow, what an incredible keynote." Brian, that was just amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Incredibly inspiring. Identity must not predict success. And what kind of university do we want for tomorrow? These are incredibly powerful questions. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the provost offices. I just wanted to say I'm not your only host today, and not everybody's only host today. The provost offices at both UBC Vancouver and UBC Okanagan, and on behalf of CTLT at UBCV and CTL at UBCO, this was amazing. Just an incredible conversation starter. I have a million questions. People, please put questions into the Q&A or into the chat. We will see them and we will begin to ask those questions on your behalf. I just wanted to connect with some of the things that you were saying. I think the most powerful thing, first of all, the idea of identity not predicting to success links very strongly, I think, with what we were talking about before, which was the notion of decolonization and the way that we have really been trained to educate, which is through these sort of really almost cruel scare tactics of assessment. Mm-hmm. It's something that we need to be inspired to get away from, because we need a tremendous amount of courage to be able to have faith that we can do anything beyond it. And you talked about that humiliating walk to the office hours as a sort of mission of not really belonging, and that deep sense of not belonging. when you and I were talking about this keynote before,
Mhm,
um, you had mentioned something really inspiring, and I wanted to ask you a follow-up about it. Um,
mhm,
you had said that, right now, AI, the results that we get are so tremendously biased and in many cases very ugly, very reductive and incredibly stereotypical. And these are reflections, of course, you pointed out rightly, of our collective understanding of how the world is. And you said that you were toying with this idea that rather than trying to cull the results that were coming out of AI, that we should instead change ourselves to train a better
mhm.
future models of AI and be better ourselves. I was wondering if you could say more about that.
Yeah. I think what I worry about sometimes with the AI conversation is that um, it becomes a little bit of a us versus machine binary, and the collective feels the need to, okay, you get into conversations about how you stop cheating and how you get people to not use ChatGPT to do their essays and things like that. And I think I don't want to sound like a defeatist, but I think, how I've seen technology go, right, it's headed in one direction, right? So I don't see a future where these tools don't exist, and I'm definitely not anti the tools themselves. I think, how they're used is different. So knowing and accepting that they're going to exist, to me, the question you ask yourself is, well, what are some of the issues that those tools have right now? What are some of the kind of ugliest consequences from them? And what role can we play in preventing those things from happening, right? And knowing that at least right now, so much of those things require human input, require it being fed data from our own behavior and our own choices. Then the question stands, well, what are our choices? What are our behaviors? Like, and so when these things spit out results that are biased, like we can't get locked into seeing it as a problem with the tool. We have to see it as a reflection of ourselves. And that's the harder question, right? That's where the human element of some of these things never really goes away. And I would like us, whether we are in ed tech, whether we're in the classroom, whether we're administration, I would like us to start thinking about these things in that way, right? Um, you know, God forbid you can you imagine a world where the inputs that feed the algorithm and what the algorithm spits out actually does it in a way that's equity based? I mean, it almost sounds even weird to make that statement, right? But that's almost kind of like the pie in the sky dream I'm having here, right? Anyway, thanks for your question.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that is the pie in the sky. I think, it is so interesting because you're right. It's absolutely a reflection right now of who we are. And I think it is fascinating because in many ways we're quite um, alarmed by the reflection that we're seeing back. We're very concerned because even, the way that we are um, that we're forced to confront our own history for the first time, maybe for some, really forced to just in this casual use of a tool, really changes our perspectives, hopefully, on ourselves. It's a wonderful call to community and to awareness. So we have some questions in the chat, but I also wanted to ask you to turn a question around that you had asked us, which is what kind of
Mhm.
university do we want for tomorrow? Um, I think I can imagine what you're imagining, but I would love to hear more about what kind of university you would imagine. What would it look like for inclusivity
Oof.
to be the default and for identity to truly not matter um, when someone is walking into a classroom, that they don't have to feel fundamentally apologetic about who they are entering that classroom
Mhm.
space?
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, first we'll call it Wakanda State University for my Black Panther fans out there. That's a dream I had. Um, so I want to start with imagining a university that really truly recognizes that education and in its holistic sense is its core product. And then imagining what does that look like to support that process, right? So in that type of institution, a center for teaching excellence or a center for teaching and learning is just as robustly funded, staffed, um, and given space at the same level of like an office of sponsored research, right? That to me, you communicate the value of your mission through how you support the core piece of that operation, right? So then that allows you to have expectations of who gets privilege of being in the classroom, um, and the expectations of those of not just the expectations, but how they are treated, right? There's a flattening of compensation in terms of there's not tens of thousands of dollars in terms of pay gap between teachers and research faculty. People are actually given the kind of time they need to do course design, to do peer observations, to reflect, to improve. Teaching is viewed almost scientifically, and that it's a journey. You're never perfect, but you're always looking for ways to improve, and you have a supportive structure to do that, right? And so then when instructors feel supported, when chairs feel supported, when people have their sort of other needs are taken care of and they feel a certain level of professional and political respect, then they can create a classroom where when students walk in, this is a community. I'm not saying we're best friends. I'm saying we're here for a goal. We're here to unpack some really tough questions. We're here to go at each other, disagree, agree, hug it out. We're here to write. We're here to communicate. We're here we're here to discover, right? We're here to learn from history in our discipline, but also figure out what are the next big things that our discipline needs to unpack and prepare ourselves to be mentally ready for that. Um, yeah, man, I could go on and on, but I think you get sort of a general picture, right? In Trinidad, we say it's a vibe, right?
Yeah, I think
It's a
that is
short way of saying all of that.
yeah, I think that is a very inspiring picture. I feel like we need to have you back to talk about that. But there are a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to start reading them. So Catherine Ron asks, one of the pedagogical strategies you mentioned was guideposting to prepare students for difficult dialogues. Could you please say a bit more about that? And if you have any references or keywords, that would be amazing as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to maybe I can send this to you after, Elisa, but I can share the list of guideposts. So where it came from, in 2020, I believe it was, I did some training, like I was a participant in a difficult dialogue training in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, with a group that is now called the Alluvial Collective. They used to be called the William Winter Institute, and they do difficult dialogue training on like a whole other level, right? I mostly work with faculty and higher institutions of higher education, but for example, they helped University of Mississippi get the Confederate flag off of their school flag. So I mean, talk about you know diametric situations, right? And it was just a wonderful training. And one of the things we did was guide posting, which I took from that and I now use in my class, I use in professional development. So I'm happy to send Elisa a copy of it. But just to tell you a little bit how it works in class, it's 9 statements and we read it aloud, right? I'll read the first one, and then somebody volunteered to read the second one, somebody else volunteered to read the third one, and we would take our time and we go through each one. And then I ask the question, okay, take 30 seconds to think about what we just read, and then ask yourself which one of these guideposts might you struggle with the most. And then we have a conversation around that. And sometimes we decide maybe we need to edit the guidepost a little bit in order to, fit the norms of the class, right? So the reason why it's called guideposts and not like contract or rules and stuff, you don't want to make it feel legalistic. You don't want to make it feel like, we don't like you anymore, get off the island, right? What you're trying to do is set the cultural norms needed for respectful discussion, right? It's almost as saying like, look, man, these are what my red lines are, right? Or these, I can do such. I'm happy to disagree, but this is an area where we just can't go, right? And we have that discussion openly. Every student has a copy, right? Every 3 weeks when they evaluate each other in for group work stuff, I encourage them to refer back to the guidepost, what worked, what didn't work. So that's in a nutshell how it works.
Amazing, thanks. And yeah, it would be great if you could share those and then we can distribute them to attendees after this session. Absolutely. Um, So we have a question from Brad Weatherick, who I think you know. He says, "Can you
Never
speak
heard of
to?"
it.
Yeah, hi Brad. Can you speak to how you found networks for significant conversations about teaching? Even oh, the it has just disappeared. Just a sec. Sorry, I double clicked on something. Sorry, I'm reading it more. Can you
Okay.
speak to how you found networks for significant conversations about teaching? So kindred spirits with whom to reflect on teaching, even when folks in your own department may not have been on board or may have been skeptical with the ideas and practices you were advancing. How did you find your community? I think I would like to echo that question. I think a lot of us here are here because we believe very deeply in this purpose. But these are
Mhm.
hard conversations, not just with our students, but also with our colleagues, and having the courage to be able to have these conversations and not be told that we're off topic.
Right,
These
right.
are, this is it's hard for people who are tenured and who are fully promoted, and very difficult for people who are pre-tenure to be able to have the courage to delve into these areas. So how do you find support, or how do you recommend others find support?
Yeah, it's a great question. In keeping with the spirit of recommending resources, I recommend the book Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. And one of the things that I found really useful about that book is it took a better angels of our nature kind of approach to change, right? In that it assumed that, as I do, that people who may not be fully on board with this approach to the classroom right now does not equate, doesn't mean they hate students. It doesn't mean they're terrible people, right? People who don't necessarily do all inclusive practices, it doesn't mean they're racist, right? Then so you have to kind of, and I have to say that because I think sometimes in our field, some people kind of fall into that trap a little bit where they other people who don't drink the Kool-Aid immediately, right? And what Chip and Dan he says in the beginning is like, okay, let's just start with. They use a different example, but I will use teaching. Let's just start with you and I both got a terminal degree in this subject matter, and we love it, right? And let's just assume that both of us, in a perfect world, want students to love it as much as we do, right? We think if we could just start there and agree on that, right? Now we may disagree on how to get to that love. We may disagree on how to build confidence. We can agree that like this is such cool stuff in this discipline that it would be nice if more people were part of this community. So then with that, what you what you what you come to accept is that different things people respond to different types of data, I should say, differently, right? um for some people, they had to see the data that I showed you. It was only when they saw p-values and publications that they're like, oh, okay, he has a point. For some people, it was when students who were in my class who then went to their class and say, hey, professor, I kind of know what I should be getting out of this experience. And this is not, I mean, they don't say it like that, right? But my point is, when the voices of the students came to them, they had different ears on, right? For some people, quite frankly, it was the dean who would knock on the door and say, hey, man, we're going in a different direction. Like you needed some leadership, right? People who had the political capital to set the terms for what they expected teaching came from the department. But my point is that took like 6 years. Yeah, I had to be patient, right? I had people come up to me, especially year one and two, and say, you can't come here to change us. I'm not trying to change you. I never went to anybody, but what I understood, and this is I like to call this the Father forgive them for they know not what they do mentality. What I understood is that was coming from a place of fear. So, Brad, people like you and I, when we walk into a room and talk about inclusive and active and decolonization, what people are hearing is, are you saying that I've been a colonizer this whole time? Are you saying I've been terrible at my job for the last 20 years? And so what they do then is they either get defensive or they lash out. And so recognizing that, in the same way we are asking to be humanist to our students, to be kind and loving to our students, we have to be kind to each other. And so when those same individuals came 5, 6 years later to ask about, oh, how do you cut content? How did you don't get revenge, you don't do any of that stuff. You say, I'm just glad you're here. To my pre-tenure people, I want to send you a lot of love. And Elisa, I know this was your question, your addition to Brad's question. Um, and I'm always a little hesitant to answer that particular question. I always answer it, right? But hesitant just from the standpoint of I don't feel it's my place to tell people how much risk you're willing to take. That's a personal decision. I will say there are a lot more institutions now who support teaching and excellence in teaching than there were 10, 15, 20 years ago. But I know the landscape still isn't where we want it to be, right? And if you're pre-tenure and you're feeling the weight of that lack of capital to the point where you kind of have to feel like you have to pick and choose how and when to have this conversation and do what you really want to do, I understand that feeling. I will tell you that when I was pre-tenure, my wife and I rented on purpose because I wanted tenure to come on my terms. I wanted tenure to come because I did the things that were valuable to me. When I was a 16-year-old secondary school student in Trinidad, my first generation parents, they didn't tell me about medicine and lawyers and engineers like the students I taught. They said to me, whatever choices you make in life, you make it in accordance with your values. That's what drives everything. Your partner, your friends, your hobbies, your job, your subjects, everything. Your values is what comes first. So my value said, look, I'm not working through the weekend to do above and beyond just to get that. My value said, I'm not going to ignore an intro bio class to get a bunch of stuff out just to say I got to. No, no, no. We're going to build this package the way we think it should be built and trust that there's leadership who will support it. So if there are deans in the audience, man, I really, well, not just deans, right? These things go up like 9 levels, but the people who have the power to push levels that support the pre-tenure faculty among us, I beg of you to lean into this work.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but I have a couple of questions, and there are some themes developing in the questions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them comes down to that statement that you made about accountability and about how we look at our curve of grades and our outcomes for our students, and there's a sense of blame. We blame our students when they fail our class. They failed the class. We didn't fail the students.
Right.
They failed our class.
Right.
We have a strong sense that we need to show as educators that we can test students and that we can certify their learning. And that is terrifying to students, and it does set up this this pernicious effect where students are put in a panicked mode, and learning doesn't happen in a place of panic. What you're talking about is inclusion and acceptance and a real sense of love in the classroom that is antithetical to this imposition of fearful assessment. So a lot of the questions in the chat have kind of gotten at this, and some questions that I've been receiving from other channels as well. How do we change the way that we assess students? How does assessment look when we're trying to engender this sense of real inclusion, real sort of intellectual relaxation and receptivity in students?
Great set of questions, I should call that, right? I know we don't have much time, so I'll try to be brief, and maybe the best way to do this, given the time, is just to give an example from my own class. We have what I like to call a diffuse assessment model, in that we have what you might call summative exams, right? There are 4 of them. The fourth one is funny. I tell the students it's not a final, it's just a 4th exam. But like the university had a policy, like you had to call it a final. What is good? So I guess you just had to label it that. But like in reality, it was just the 4th exam. But whatever. But what is the thing I want to zero in on here is in the 3rd week of class, or maybe the 4th week, we used to call it early intervention week. And by we, I mean me and my learning assistants, right? And so what I would do is I would reach out to the bottom 30% of my roster. like at that point, whatever their cumulative grade was at that point, I would reach out to them, email, call, whatever. But no matter what, I got 100% of them talking to me one-on-one, right? And you have to understand that at this point, I have like 4 quizzes, one major exam, one group project, group evaluation of each other. They do reflective assignments for me before class starts called This I Believe from NPR. thisibelieve.org/guidelines if you want to check it out. I have like a survey. So I have like a lot of information about them. So when you show up to my office, I can say, hey, Eliza, you do really well when I ask you recall questions, but you seem to struggle when I say synthesize. Or your group work is going well, or how are things going at home? I know you said that you go home every weekend. So I can have a broad conversation, right? And it's never like, hey man, you need to study harder, right? It's tell me, what do you think you need to be more successful? Is there anything that's kind of troubling you? Because if we can get specific, right, then I can give them something to work on. I can say, okay, if you're spending all night reading the book, why don't you try spend a little bit less time, pick one concept and go to a whiteboard and explain it to your roommate. Try that. Let's see what happens in the next quiz. So by giving them a strategy that's implementable, it promotes a growth mindset, because I'm not saying a fixed thing. Well, you need to study hard. Well, they're probably studying very hard, just not doing it very well, right? So my point to the person who's asking the question is that I use the assessments as a data gathering mechanism for both them and myself. And because I turn it into a dialogue, they are not just seeing the assessments as a measurement of who they are as a biologist. It's a conversation with the sort of quantitative data being the starting point, right? But then that leads to, okay, well, what does this tell you and I about where you are in terms of your understanding? Hope that there's a lot more. It's a beautiful set of questions, but I think that's a good one to respond with.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's something that we really um, are starting to shift at UBC. Is the way that we do assess people, and the kind of dialogue. That's a wonderful way to see it. Thank you for framing it like that. That it's not about them proving themselves to you. It's about you understanding where they are so that you can work with them in a back and forth kind of way. It really is the beginning of building up a relationship, as opposed to thresholds or hurdles or whatever they need to jump over. So there was one question about technology in the list. So just this, and there are a whole bunch of other questions. Tamara Ebel has a great question, lots of great questions. I think I'm going to have to forward these to you and get them, get a little.
I'm happy to
That would be
get
great,
reply.
because we're super out of time. But I just wanted to ask this one. Oh dear, it's disappeared, it seems. But it was sort of like, we're moving into this new world of AI. How do you decide whether to bring in new technology as a facilitative force? Is this something that you're plunging into, or is it something where you're like, I think I'm going to hold off and remain with my traditional approaches? How are you addressing this new stage in your own work?
I mean, honestly, if I'm to be completely honest, man, I'm excited. In that I am not a Luddite, right? I'm not. I like to consider myself a late adopter, right? My first iPhone was the iPhone 8, right? Like, right. I mean, not that I was anti-smart. I want them to work the kinks out, and then I'll figure out, how I use it for my benefit. And there's a sense in which I treat my classroom the same way. To me, what matters, like what I spend my summer doing, not all summer, but a chunk of time, when I look back at my course design and the things I want to change, I think about the human values I want surface. That's what governs everything. How do I create more dialogue? How do I create more rich conversation? How do I make people feel comfortable in doing that? The students feel comfortable doing that. And then the subsequent question is, in what ways can technology be my friend in order to make that happen, right? And so that sometimes means using some, but not all the technology. Sometimes it means just going completely tech free. sometimes we in an active learning classroom with the TVs on and the graphs and they're going back and forth and they're switching. I mean, so we could kind of go either way with it. I definitely don't want to I don't live in fear of it, right? And one of the things I can share with you, Eliza, is I wrote a book chapter a few years ago on ed tech and higher ed, which is basically answering this very same question, like how do we kind of think and center human values with the, I want to say, almost onslaught of ed tech and how to make those decisions. So that might be a longer but more comprehensive answer.
Well, that sounds like excellent follow-up reading. I think we'll distribute that link when we thank everybody for joining. We have indulgently gone slightly over time, but we got a bit of a late start, so I think that's probably
It's all
okay.
good. It's all good.
I just want to thank you so much, Brian, for joining us today and for helping us really foreground the human that it is that we're trying to remember in our loop. It's vitally important to keep in the front of our minds all of the things that you've discussed today. I look forward to a continued conversation. And again, on behalf of both campuses and both provost offices and both CTL and CTLTs, I just want to say thank you so much for an inspiring talk and a great opener to our week. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.